Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is going to be the video to finish the immune chapter, and then I want to just provide a couple review tips for our next exam. This is Dr. Jenkins, of course. Our next exam is going to include the blood vessels, lymphatic, and immune chapters. So here we go. We ended in lecture I tried to keep it very simple. We talked about the third line of defense. You'll have to forgive me. I don't know where on earth these black things came from. When I uploaded this to my iPad, it somehow did that. So just ignore them, please. We ended, and these circles, please ignore. I know. We ended by comparing and contrasting T cells and B cells. These are part of the third line of defense. And then in class, I gave you a quick summary of the steps for each. So that's where we ended. We remember that B cells work through antibodies. So that's where I want to pick up where we left off, and excuse me for going so quickly. We ended off with B cells, B as in boy, and they, of course, utilize antibodies. Now, for this class, you do not need to know the specifics of antibodies. I give you some of the information. The only thing that I want you to be reminded of is antibodies are specific to the antigens. So we produce an antibody that is specific to target a particular virus, for example. Okay. But all the rest here is extra, okay? You don't need to know the specifics of antibodies. All right. The last thing for this chapter that I am going to ask you to know involves different types of immunity. So that's where we're going to pick up where we left off. This can be tricky, so please listen along. You may have to spend some time with this because for whatever reason, it's tricky. Ultimately, we're going to end up with 4 types of immunity. And I'm going to give you an example of each. 1, 2, 3, 4. Before we do that, though, let me just start with some basic definitions. So this is going to be the summary slide that you're going to need to know. But to help us understand these, let's go back. Let's first define active. If you ever see the word active as it relates to immunity, that means that the body itself produced the antibody. Active. Body produces antibody. Anytime your body makes the antibody, it's considered active. Passive means the antibody was given to you passively. I'm going to give examples in a moment. Passively. So this has everything to do with active versus passive, has to do with the way in which the antibodies were produced or delivered. So when we're talking about active versus passive, we're talking about the means of antibody production or delivery. How the antibody is produced or delivered. Yes. So in active, your body makes the antibody. Think about a vaccine. A vaccine, they purposely give you a little bit of a virus so that your body makes the antibody. Another example is just natural exposure. I touch a doorknob that has a virus on it. My body's exposed to that virus. In active, my body makes the antibody. Anytime your body makes the antibody, you have memory. We only have memory for antibodies when your body makes it. Passive. An example of passive would be a mom giving an antibody to a fetus. A pregnant mom giving an antibody to a fetus. The fetus did not make the antibody themselves. Therefore, if the body did not make the antibody themselves, there's no memory. All right? These can be tricky. I'm doing the best I can to be as simple as possible. Active versus passive. This has everything to do with how the antibodies are produced or delivered. Anytime your body makes the antibody, it's active. You have memory because you made it. Anytime you're delivered the antibody passively, you did not make it passively. It's a passive. Therefore, no memory. Then, let's talk about natural versus artificial. I'll choose a different color. So here in natural versus artificial, we're not talking about the means of antibody production. In active versus passive, it was, let me go to black here. In active versus passive, it's how the antibody is produced or delivered. But in natural versus artificial, it's about how you were exposed to the virus, for example. How you were exposed to the pathogen or virus. Oftentimes with this, we're talking about viruses, but it could be other pathogens, i.e. virus. So natural versus artificial is how you were exposed to the pathogen, not the antibody, the pathogen, the virus. Here it was how the antibody is produced or delivered. Either your body produces the antibody, active, or it was somehow delivered to you passively. Antibody. Here, it's how you were exposed to the pathogen. In a natural exposure, it's a natural or non-deliberate. A natural exposure means you got it from the air, or I touched that doorknob. That's a natural exposure. I was exposed to the virus naturally. I touched the doorknob without knowing it. I got it from the air. An artificial exposure is a deliberate exposure. Think about a vaccine. That's not a natural, accidental exposure. You didn't just happen to bump into the vaccine. You purposely went to a doctor to get an injection for the vaccine. We purposely exposed ourselves to the virus for a reason, because we wanted our body to produce the antibodies. But that would be an artificial exposure, like a vaccine. So please spend some time with these. They can be confusing. Even for me, they can be confusing. So I would encourage you to start there. Then we can put them all together. So I'm just going to circle or underline an example of each. Natural, active. This means you encountered a virus on the doorknob and you produced an antibody from it. Or when you were younger, you were exposed to chickenpox virus in school and you produced an antibody to it. So body produces antibodies from regular exposure. So if I just put, let's see, if I just put chickenpox, does that give you an answer? Meaning you were exposed to it, you produce the antibody. Artificial active would be like a vaccine. In both of these cases, it's active. Whether I was exposed naturally, like chickenpox virus in elementary school, or my exposure was deliberate through a needle vaccine. But in both cases, your body has made the antibody, so it's active. But the exposure is different. Natural passive would be antibodies from the fetus to the mother. I like to use different colors. I don't know why. It keeps things interesting for me. Natural passive, antibodies to fetus from mother. It's passive. The fetus did not produce the antibodies themselves, but it was a natural exposure. Naturally, the blood is shared, so naturally there's going to be exposure. The last thing is artificial passive, and this would be like an antivenom. That's the example I'm going to use. Let's say that you, unfortunately, got bit by a poisonous spider. If you were bit, I never know how to say that, by a poisonous spider, you don't want to wait for your body to naturally produce the antibodies. There could be poison coursing through your bloodstream. So we don't want to wait for our body to naturally make antibodies. So we get a needle of the antivenom. We purposely get antibodies given to us. So it's a passive means of exposure because it's from a needle, and it's artificial because you didn't make the antibodies. There's no memory. But in that instance, quick is the name of the game. So please make sure you look over all of these. Okay. The last point I want to make, a couple things here. I just want you to remember that our immune system is always working. You know, we tend to think of it only working when we're sick and we have a fever or we're coughing. But even if you're not having outward symptoms, some of your immune cells are working. So we're always using our immune system. We only show symptoms when our immune system can no longer keep up with the attack from the bad guys. So it's just working all the time. We only show the physical symptoms when, for a period, our own immune system cannot keep up with the bacteria or viruses. Make sure you can have a simple definition of autoimmune. We talked about this already, I think. When your body attacks something normal. For whatever reason, your body is not able to differentiate self from non-self, and it attacks normal tissue. Lastly, there's immunodeficiency diseases. Yeah, an immunodeficiency disease is when there's a loss of immune system function. So it's not necessarily autoimmune, but part of your immune system is not working as it should. The example we gave was AIDS, right? Where the AIDS virus attacks our T cells. So our immune system, the T cells, are deficient. And that person doesn't necessarily die from AIDS. They die from a common cold because they no longer have as many T cells as they need. All right, good job, everybody. Now, I usually don't do this, but we have a little bit of extra time. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to just review the major things from each chapter. You already know this because we've gone through it, but I'm trying to help you, and sometimes I feel like people get very overwhelmed. So if you think this will be helpful, please stick around. Don't try and study everything at once. There's so much. But can we make a study sheet from your notes that you already have? Can you use this and go back to your notes and study it for half an hour one time? Go have dinner, do something else, come back, study it again. Small bits over and over and over again. For example, hold on. Hey, Kima! My cat is scratching something. I don't want her to. I don't think so. Who does she think she is? Okay. So for blood vessels, sorry about that, we talked about the structure of blood vessels. We talked about the 3 layers of the blood vessel wall. And then we talked about the differences between arteries, veins, and capillaries. We talked about being able to know what a portal system is and be able to give an example. We talked about resting blood distribution. For example, is there more blood at rest in our veins or arteries? Then we talked about blood distribution at rest versus exercise. Where do we send more blood at rest? Where do we send more blood during exercise? I think I might need this whole page. Now, this is nothing new. I'm reviewing what we've already talked about, but a summary, okay? To try and make your life easier. Go back to your notes and study each of these small bits often. Be able to define flow versus perfusion. Talked about that. Then we talked about the principles of blood flow. And for that, we had two equations. We had flow is proportionate to change in pressure over resistance. And then we had blood pressure being equal to cardiac output times peripheral resistance. From those two, we can identify and understand fluid dynamics. Remember, there's those review questions on Brightspace, okay? All right. We talked about definition of blood pressure, be able to define blood pressure, give an overall normal value of systolic over diastolic. And then there was the biggie, right? We talked about 3 ways that we regulate. Excuse me. So for these, you need to know all of it. We talked about the auto-regulation. That is our ability to constrict and dilate at the arterioles to alter flow. Then we talked about the nervous system. Hold on for 1 second. Kima! Hey! I think she's trying to make a point. My students hear you? Okay. We talked about the second way, which was the nervous system. And we can use the sympathetic nervous system to vasodilate to working skeletal muscles, but also vasoconstrict to all the other peripheral blood vessels to maintain a high blood pressure overall. We talked about the medulla overseeing this regulation through receiving feedback from baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Be able to give an example of each of those. And then we talked about our good old friend, the renin-angiotensin mechanism, which is our long-term regulator for pressure. Renin-angiotensin, which is our long-term regulator of blood pressure through regulating blood pressure by changing blood volume. So be able to know all of those things that we talked about. We talked about capillary exchange. So we talked about how we move solutes. We talked about solutes of smaller size like gases, diffusion, medium size like glucose, and then larger size like hormones, how they move from the capillary into the tissues and vice versa. Make sure you can have an idea of some of the things that are moving from the capillaries out into the blood, and then things that are moving from the blood back into the capillaries. But then we also talked about, at the capillary exchange, movement of fluid. And our movement of fluid, as you recall, was dictated by a balance of forces, hydrostatic versus osmotic. So know what those two pressures mean, which direction they're pushing or pulling fluid, and then what we want the overall net to be. The last thing we talked about were mechanisms of venous return. So we talked about all the possible ways of venous return, and then we talked about what we rely on most. All right. Lymphatic was a shorter chapter. You can always pause this video and you can see that summary list. Lymphatic was our shortest chapter, but in my experience, some people don't take enough time with it. It's like, oh, it's so easy. Well, you still have to study it, right? So I want you to do well on this part because it's more straightforward, but you still have to put some attention towards it. So we talked about the functions of the lymphatic system, all those functions. We talked about the structure and function of each component. So the functions overall of this system. And then we talked about the structure and function of each individual component. So we talked about let me just change colors to mix things up a little bit. I liked that blue we used earlier. It's pretty. We talked about the lymphatic fluid. We talked about the lymphatic vessels. That includes the capillaries, how they compare to the blood capillaries. That includes all the different types of lymphatic vessels. What's the order that they're in from the periphery back to the heart? We talked about overall what lymphatic vessels are structured like veins, right? We talked about lymphatic tissue. In other words, what type of fiber makes up the most of lymphatic tissue? By the way, it was reticular connective tissue. We talked about the lymph nodes, that they're numerous, that lymphatic fluid is filtered again and again, that they're clustered in certain areas. We talked about a basic mechanism for how these lymph nodes filter, and then what they do if they identify a foreign agent. We talked about certain organs like the spleen, structure and function, and we talked about the thymus gland. Good. We talked about the differences between a primary and secondary lymphatic organ. So review that. We talked about the 3 tonsils. So you should know for the 3 tonsils their overall function, and then know location for each. Location, overall function. We talked about the 2 collecting ducts, what blood vessel they're going to dump any remaining lymphatic fluid into. And then for each collecting duct, where it drains from. One drains from only one side of the body, one drains from the entire lower body, trunk, and then just one side of the other side of the body. And then just have an idea of lymphedema, why it might happen. All right, good. And then our last one that we just did would be immune. So this is nothing new, folks. I'm just trying to provide ways that you can kind of make your own review sheet and to encourage you to not feel overwhelmed. Take a couple of these at a time, go study, memorize, come back to it, and then add on the next one. For immune, we talked about what specific versus non-specific means. We talked about which lines of defense are specific and which lines of defense are not specific. Then we had our first line of defense. Make sure you know what its components are and examples of each. So what makes it up, and give some examples of each. Components and examples of each. Then we talked about the second line of defense. This was the big boy, because this had 5 different mechanisms. For each, be able to identify the mode of killing. And then there were some other definitions mixed in there, like Talked about a fever. You should know why that's beneficial in limited amounts. For the inflammation process, we talked about 4 terms: leukocytosis, margination, diapedesis, chemotaxis. So make sure you go through all of those things. We talked about ways in which the body can differentiate self from non-self. How body differentiates self from non-self. We talked about 2 ways, the opsonins and the MHC proteins, be able to give a basic definition of those. I'm going to switch color just for the fun of it. We talked about the 3rd line of defense. We talked about the 3rd line of defense having memory. The other ones don't. We talked about the 2 components that make it up, our T cells and B cells. For each of the T cells and B cells, you should know general characteristics, which we have more of, whether they kill directly or indirectly, whether they tend to work on extracellular or intracellular components. And then we talked about the steps of how each works. We talked about, in this last video that you're still watching, the types of immunity, active versus passive, natural versus artificial. Be able to give an example of each. And then we talked about what an autoimmune disorder is, when the body attacks something that's normal in itself. And then we talked about an immunodeficiency. So just know how they're different. Immunodeficiency. All right. So we have time. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm always here. Study, study, study. There are review questions under immune as well. So please utilize them. Good luck, folks.